fine. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know that it's not only a bad day to really go anywhere because of the tragedy and misery that comes with it, but also it's practically difficult to get anywhere because of preparations for anti-protest events. So thank you very much. And also may I thank the BIAA, who have been very generous in providing me with a fellowship this year and enabling me to meet and talk with a number of different people, all of whom give feedback and end up basically being co-authors of papers like this, even though they don't get the credit. My title is obviously Art and War, but what I'm talking about here is not a direct connection between the two, so I'm not going to talk about images of battle or images of strife and war. It's more about the complex relationship between the impact of war on the economy and identity in art. And the important point is that this is indirect and not a direct thing. A lot of my work concerns assessing the emergence of formation of identities in historical context, using images as a primary data source. And this is not just because I'm an art historian, it's because there actually is little textual data from this period. There are very few local Anatolian inscriptions. There are some Phrygian ones, largely votive and very rarely funerary inscriptions, but nothing really historical until later on. And so for historical events of the period, event history, we rely largely on Greek authors like Herodotus and Thucydides, and sometimes later Roman period authors like Plutarch and Diodorus, who write about the history of periods much earlier than theirs. And these histories generally concern the political events of the period. So the conquest of Anatolia and the Greeks of Ionia by the Achaemenid Persians in the 540s BC, and the subsequent hostilities that emerged between especially the Greeks and the Persians, which culminated in the great Persian war battles in 480 and 479 BC, and the subsequent formation of the Athenian-led Delian League. And sometimes it's represented as though the Persian wars were over in 480 and 479. This is not true. They continued on. The formation of the Delian League was a part of this, and they continued on till at least the middle of the 5th century, if not after. When trying to understand the adoption of certain methods of representation in imagery, then this strife forms the contextual background. And what I found is often the iconography of the tombs that I deal with were being read as political responses, straightforward political responses. So the attention was focused on whether and how these images betrayed cultural and political affiliations on some level. So that is more or less direct responses to the Greco-Persian wars. And when I was assessing the materials from Xanthos, which date to about 460 BC, I found that the materials there really highlighted the way that that doesn't really work very well. The art really can't simply be placed in this kind of binary division between Greek and Persian, either politically or sometimes even stylistically. And at the same time, I started to think about the context, which is very, very complex. And if anyone's ever tried to read about Lycian history, especially in the middle of the 5th century, your mind will just melt after a while. So there were several developments which happened during this time, including building programs, production of a large array of silver coins, and an alliance with the Delian League, so switch of alliance, as it were. And there are several explanations put forward to account for this, which are all very entangled and confusing. So while one scholar would see, for instance, the affiliation with the Delian League as very nominal, another one sees this as, together with the coins, as evidence for radical overhauling of the Lycian political structure and setup of a democratic institution. Now, thinking about that kind of complexity, I started to think about how the Lycians were able to start urbanism projects and produce great numbers of coins in the first place. After all, this is a period of strife, and largely the Lycians have been seen as a passive people in between these greater powers. But their activities, of course, point to something much more. And following up on this meant a rather different way of seeing the projects and art of the period, not directly as a response, but as something enabled by the particular features of the period. So this is what I want to talk about today. So first, what I'll do is show you something of the art to explain the usual approach and the problems arising, and then I'll move on to a model of economic activity which may have underwritten the programs, and look at how this might affect the way we rethink Lycian identities and art of this period. So first of all, just to give you a sense of where we're talking about, Lycia is located on the corner of the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean here, an area that was seen as very strategic, or it has been seen as very strategic by modern historians for the Athenians and the Persians. In the 460s BC, there was a great battle at the Eurymedon River near Spendos over here, and people have thought that after that, this is the early 460s, there was a kind of boundary between the Persian Empire, the Persian-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, and the Athenian-led Aegean area, with the attempts of the Delian League to try and gain places like Cyprus and Egypt, and of course Xanthos as well. So it's on this very politically sensitive area in that sense. Now, I talked before about building program at Xanthos, and these are some of the buildings that went up during the 460s, so probably in the period after Eurymedon. These are reconstructions based on very few fragments, but they give you a kind of sense of what they looked like. These are stone buildings imitating timber structures. And people who have wanted to talk about Lycian identities and the place of Lycia, the role of Lycia at this time, have tended to concentrate on this particular frieze, which has been attributed to the side of building G. And this has been seen as a very Persianizing motif. And if you compare it to these reliefs from the Iranian palace of Persepolis, far, far to the east, you can see some similarities. The way that these courtiers are shown, one looking back, interacting with each other in these great processional reliefs. These are on stairways at Persepolis. And also, although these are slightly different because they show tributaries bringing gifts for the Persian king, and that's not what you really see here, you can see very clearly how the horses are decorated in very similar sorts of ways with these forelocks tied up. Very, very Eastern in style, if you want to phrase it in terms of East and West. And most particularly the way this groom is shown leading the horse over here, which is a very common motif that you find at Persepolis. So people have taken this as a sign that there was a great desire to affiliate with the Persians culturally at Xanthos. And some people have tied this to the idea that there was a Median or Persian dynasty at Xanthos ever since the Persian conquest as well. I can't go into the details of that, but if you want to ask me about that later, do. There's no actual really hardcore evidence for that. And actually, if you look more closely at these reliefs, you see just as many differences. Now, I'll just show here as well, there's this general kind of convoy type of motif fits in with a very common theme that emerges around the time of the Persian Wars in Western Anatolia. And these are two other examples. One from wooden beams from the Tatarla painted tomb in Phrygia, and another from the Karabarun tomb in a Isla that we'll come to. It's usually called North Lycia, but it's probably not actually technically part of Lycia. And you can see these guys seated in these chariots here in the same way that this guy is seated here. But if you look at what they're wearing, it's quite different. So this is the man from the Karabarun tomb, And I've put a little drawing over here because you can't see it so well in the painting. But he's shown wearing a red or purple outfit with tight fitted sleeves, and importantly this coat which is hung over the shoulders. And not only that, this is a Candace coat. It's something that's found very often on the meads that are shown in the Persepolis reliefs, and they're even shown fiddling with their coat strings. This is a kind of string that goes across the front to prevent it from falling off your shoulders, because you don't put your arms through the sleeves. That would not be done. So he's shown fiddling with his coat strings in exactly the same way meads are shown fiddling with their coat strings in Persepolis reliefs. And he's got this soft cap on. If you compare this to the guy at Xanthos, he's got this big fluffy Ionian chiton and a nice zigzaggy hemmed himation, the kind of things that you find in Ionian art, and Ionian sculpture mostly, and largely of a period before this. You also find it in Attic, the dress that's shown on Attic pots of this time. And these chitons are not only worn by him, they're even worn by riders. I mean, this is nonsense. You don't go around wearing these things when you ride, and we'll see some riding outfits later on. Quite often people do adopt, quite specifically, Persian dress styles, nice leather pants or something at this time. But these people have specifically chosen to show themselves in these fluffy, hiked-up chitons. And these figures here are shown wearing those as well. So despite the horse's forelocks, that's quite an important factor. Now, on a larger scale, if you look at the other images that are chosen to adorn the Acropolis during this time, you get further and further away from anything you can really happily call Persianizing. So these are some of the sculptures that have also been associated with Building G. I'm sorry that this is gone a little bit scatty because of the resolution of the image. I'll come back to that. Three marble statues that were clearly imported from the Greek islands from a sculpture workshop. They're not only imported marble, they're in a new dress style, the latest dress style that's been adopted in Greek areas. And actually, these are quite famous as being one of the very few, or three of the very few, original marbles of the 5th century as well. Most of those have disappeared. And we have only Roman copies. So this is a very much an imported thing, and they're just bringing that in and adorning their Acropolis with these sorts of figures as well. And then these two friezes. So one with a chicken frieze, you could call it, but it's a cockfight. So we've got some cockerels having a go at each other along here, and it's a shame this one's so distorted because it's quite good. And also satyrs, so Greek mythological creatures, and wild beasts. Now, the chicken relief in particular is rather interesting because although this is something you do find in Anatolia, this is the Harpy monument with a little boy presenting a cockerel to this seated man. The Harpy monument from Xanthos of the period just before these buildings go up. And that has a relationship to the sorts of things that you find with cockerels being given as gifts on Attic pots. They can appear sometimes on the edges of gems, not necessarily as the main motif, and they are also in the Karaburun tomb. There's that convoy on the edge of the Kline. But the sort of thing that you see on Building G is most closely aligned with the sort of things that you find again on Attic pots, slightly earlier period. So this is a very unusual thing. It's an unusual thing to put on a building, a public building, which may be related to the fact that they are both tombs, so kind of private monuments, but also public monuments at the same time. Certainly not the thing that you'd put on a public building in the Greek world. But they're also nothing to do with Persianizing anything. The cockerel might be thought of as a Persian bird, but this is much more kind of Western koine almost activity of aristocratic behavior in Western Anatolia and the Aegean. And here's another example of something from the Acropolis, Building G. It's over here. This is that building that we just looked at. And there are these Sphinx gables that have been attributed to that. Now, when you compare the sort of Sphinxes that are right. When you compare the sort of Sphinxes that are shown there with the sort of Sphinxes that they do have at Persepolis, again, you get this really standout difference. No curly wings, none of this high hat thing. And you do find something rather similar, however, in Western Anatolia further up. This is a stele from Altantash in Western Phrygia, and here you see, although they're positioned frontally, very sort of Persian-type styled Sphinxes with these curly wings and the high hats and this plant in between. Also unusual about these Sphinxes is that they have female breasts. This is highly unusual. This is unique at the time. So they're actually inventing all by themselves a new kind of thing. And they tend to seem to like winged creatures at Xanthos at this time. They seem to be almost inventing a kind of bestiary. And another really weird thing from Xanthos, which is a gable attributed to another small building over here. Here it's supposed to show where it would go in the in the reconstructed building. Two men either side of an Ionic column with a siren type of creature at the top. Highly unusual, no real comparanda. The closest things in terms of grave sculpture are these late 5th century or 4th century Attic grave stele that tend to show sirens. In this case, I would call that a harpy, but anyway, it's supposed to be a siren, wings outspread, very similar, but they're shown in mourning gestures, performing lamentations for the dead because they have a musical sort of role. But this figure is not shown doing anything that we could recognize in that way. And there's also another group of images that one might compare it to. Here you have some sirens standing on, this one's standing on rocks, but there are two figures on either side of this, on this pot. And again, another figure is on the other side of the siren here. And this one is on either an altar or a short column, which you can barely see the edge of here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a better image of that. And they seem to be related very generally. They're musical sirens, with these images of sphinxes on columns as well. So it may be that what we have at Xanthos is that they have some kind of idea of these dangerous creatures that sit on top of columns and bother people and cause them to talk about complex ideas that they really can't solve, puzzles. And they're inventing a new kind of idea. Instead of a sphinx, it's got to be a siren. But it's unusual and not something that you usually find in the repertoire of other places. But you can find some almost extraction from what seems to be Attic art of the time. And even closer are these things, which I call erratic reliefs, because they haven't been attributed to any buildings. This shows a running woman. You can just about see her legs there running in this direction. You find that with nymphs and Maenads and things like that on Greek vases. And especially these Nike here, flying Nike, their wings are actually shown behind them, but you can't see them terribly well. But this kind of headdress, even if you do a search on Google for Attic pots with Nike on them, you'll find immediately that there's just a whole range of them. And I've walked into the Ashmolean and found a whole case of these things. And here's one good example to show the kind of styling with that Sakos headdress cap to show what they're doing here. And this is the French excavators of Xanthos actually thought that they might even be using images from Attic pots as a source. I don't know whether they were wall paintings that were an intermediary, but they certainly do seem to be drawing on those kinds of motifs. And although they are including that convoy, which seems like a more stately and official sort of image, they're also including these largely whimsical sorts of motifs. So this is not a kind of coherent public program, but a bricolage of images drawing from what is available around them. And seems to be related largely to the Aegean world, but they're creating something which is novel and collecting lots and lots of images. And this is something that you can see as well in Lycian coins of the time. What we see here is a big jump after 480 BC from a rather limited number and types of coins used to a great range, a really abundant coinage, and it's the most abundant coinage in Western Anatolia of this time, and it has a huge number of different types. The ones I'm showing here are all attributed to the leading dynast of Xanthos at the period, and his name was Cuprille. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's as close as I can get. And you can see here the range of images that are used on the, and I'm talking about the obverses. These are the reverses, and you can see his name on some of these reverses. Now, some of these are Achaemenidizing motifs. So I show here one lion griffin, another kind of lion griffin-y type of thing, and most peculiar of all is this man-headed bull with wings. This is the kind of, I can see Suzanne squinting, it's really hard to see. Here's the head, the wings, and it's just because it's blown up. So these are obviously Achaemenidizing motifs. However, they are in the minority. If you look at other coins of Cuprille, you'll see all kinds of things. So here's a winged goat, and you could say that that looks a little bit Achaemenidizing, but it's neither here nor there, really. Horse scratching its leg, kind of thing that you see on the, I guess, the Parthenon frieze later on. Here, again, this is very, very faded out, but you can see a man, a bearded man here wearing an Attic helmet, not very Persian looking. Heracles, he's carrying his club behind him here. And these two, which are very interesting, are both copies of types known from other cities. So this is a copy of a type from Cnidos, and this is a copy of a type from Kyrene, the head of Zeus Ammon, from there. So really rather more complex than simply copying Persian things. The Persian types themselves are not on coins, so they may have been copied from gems. And it looks like here what they're not interested in creating some kind of coherent program. What they're interested in is novelty and in gathering a great abundance of different kinds of images. And they're really interested, and again, like there are lots of winged animals here, so they really like those. But they seem to be interested in creating as much of a range as possible. So they're like collectors in a way. And the dyes that are used to make these coins are used for a really long time. So they appear to be almost like they're kind of precious things. And then they don't get the same thing carved again. They get something brand new. So yeah, they're kind of more like collectors than people that are putting out some kind of coherent state program of art. Now, the coins are, of course, also a literal indication of wealth in the period. And I started to think about this in a kind of tangential way at first, and thinking about, rather than the iconography chosen specifically, thinking about the larger activity. So again, the larger picture of what's going on in Lycia at the time, and why this activity emerged when it did. Especially since it's an ongoing period of strife, apparently. Other signs of prosperity are, I mean, the sculpture and the buildings that I showed you before are part of a building program. So although this is faded out, this is actually the area of the Lycian Acropolis at Xanthos, and these are some of the earliest buildings from the Acropolis. And we transform between the Persian conquest and about 470. These are the remains that were found, and this is what happens at about the time that these buildings emerged. So this is building G here, building H, and building F. Not only did those buildings go up, there's also rather larger buildings in the center of the Acropolis, about which we know hardly anything, because we just have scratchy little footprints of these buildings. But we do know there are monumental buildings. And also, importantly, walling. So traces of walls around here. And we know that this is a contemporary project because it's integrated with the base, the platform on which Building G stood. And beyond the Acropolis, there's similar masonry at other points during through the city walls. So it looks like it wasn't just the Acropolis that was walled. There was possibly a project to wall more of the city at the time, even if it wasn't all carried out at exactly that period. And also, the act of zoning, walling off this Acropolis means that there was some kind of very basic city zoning happening at this time. Now, there may have been mud brick walls before this period, so we don't know whether this is entirely new transformation. But if nothing else, it was a consolidation of what was there before, if there were walls there before, and transforming what we call now the Acropolis and marking it off from this area here, which a monument, this is the inscribed pillar from the later 5th century, and that calls the area that it stands on the Acropolis, the Agora. So there may be some kind of basic separation of city space at this time, or consolidation and emphasis of it. Outside of Xanthos, there's very little evidence for contemporary urbanization, but very little has been explored. There's been very little excavation of the periods that we're talking about, so the pre-Hellenistic period. There have been at some sites, and that's an area that I need to check more carefully. As far as I know, not a lot that shows that there's a strong urbanism going on elsewhere, but this is one example of something that could point in that direction, and this is a large podium at Avshar Tepesi in central Lycia, and people have thought that the surveyors have thought that this may be the base for a large monumental wooden building, possibly a shrine or a temple, which may indicate contemporary monumental wooden building going on. And this is the sort of thing that they may be imitating in the stone buildings that were being put up at Xanthos. The dating is not very clear, but people tend to think that this is early classical, that's about the right period. It may be an indication of something going on outside of Xanthos as well, and possibly this is always called the Archaic temple, the earlier temple at the Leaton underneath the later Apollo temple, where you have these slots for wooden beams which have been reconstructed here. Potentially also there, is that archaic or is it early classical? Maybe there's some kind of contemporary wooden construction going on there as well. That's just to try and give it some larger context and not just isolate everything to Xanthos, which is the usual thing to do. And another important example of Lycia's wealth at the time is their relative contributions to the Delian League. So when they do join the Delian League, which may have been before or after the Battle of Eurymedon, people are, again, very divided on that. They are among the high contributors. This is restored, so this is a hypothetical average year, which never really existed. But nevertheless, it does work effectively to show, to pick out which states were the high contributors. And of those states that contribute over 8 talents each, there's only 6% of states that do that in this hypothetical average year. The rest of them contribute much lower levels. And those slim 6% contribute 44% of the entire income of the league in that average year. So they're really important to the league, and Lycia is among these. They pay 10 talents. Not 30 talents of some other places, but it's still quite a high number. So the idea is Lycia's basically getting rich in this period, and the question is, how are they making their money? And this is quite a big question, and one of my friends asked me whether I could actually answer that question. He said, "Very interesting, Kathy, can you answer that?" And I kind of ummed and awed and said, maybe, I don't know, let me have a look. Because the problem is that although it's clear that something is happening, but outside of that something happening, we don't have any of the evidence for the mechanisms which allowed that to happen. So it's very difficult to actually explain that. Some people have suggested a top-down model of Persian or Athenian interference. So it's thought that the silver being supplied was coming directly from the Athenians or the Persians. And now in general, Lycian coins tend to remain within Lycia. They don't really go outside of Lycia. I'll show a distribution map later on, and you'll see that they do, which looks like I'm contradicting myself, but most of them do stay in Lycia. And they're minted on local standards, even if these are divisible into other standards, which is, again, very complex, and you can ask me about this later. But I won't go on about it here. It's a local standard. And Jan Zala, who's written about the Lycian economy most directly, has suggested from this that Lycia was relatively economically isolated. And he's proposed that, with this in mind, it must have been the Persians who were supplying the Lycians with silver, and that may have been in order to support a standing army in the region or a navy in order to defend this very strategic corner of the Eastern Mediterranean and Aegean. And another scholar, Novella Vismara, she basically agrees with this, and she's done some tests of coins, Lycian coins, and she thinks that they were made from melted down Persian sigloi. Now, her test showed that 43% of the coins that she tested, her sample, were inconsistent with the copper levels in Athenian coins, because they're very, very pure coins from the Laurian mines that they opened up in order to actually manufacture their money. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that, firstly, Athenian coins are unusually pure. So this is only it's kind of negative evidence. It's not clear that Lycian coins were manufactured from Persian sigloi simply because they weren't manufactured from Athenian coins. There are lots of other coins and silver out there that they could have used. Of course, there's also the 57%, which remains kind of unaccounted for, and that's not really unpacked in any way properly. So it's really not clear that Persian sigloi were coming in. I mean, it may have been Persian silver. So if the sources of silver, if this sigloi model is not so simply true, then perhaps one needs to think about trade and commerce. And this is difficult because it's very often invisible. But it's important because it provides the means of imaginatively creating the ghost of activities that we know must have been there, but which are no longer visible. And particularly it's important for reconstructing the role of places like Lycia, because they tend to be left out of stories written by Greek and, the Greek authors like Thucydides, who's the main source for this period. And he writes a lot about Athens, and basically their allies are doing things with them, but you never really hear a peep about what the allies are actually doing. As Susan Sherritt says, and this is the indirect model, so trade income, in feeling our way through problems raised by archaeological and textual records, we have to acknowledge that. This is a kind of riff on Donald Rumsfeld's famous speech. Most of the time we are operating in a shadowland inhabited by things we know we do not know, things we do not know we do not know, and things we think we know but might well be wrong about. All of these just as important as what we can be sure we do know. It's a bit of a mouthful. Well, that's sort of a bit depressing, but she says she doesn't believe that this should depress us. In fact, if anything, we should probably revel in the shadows, since they expand our potential to make sense of the early Mediterranean in general, and of interaction within it in particular, far beyond the narrow constraints of the information directly available to us in the ground or in texts, either alone or together. Shadows, in other words, have the advantage of making us think. So sometimes, basically, you can't just think with the available materials, but you need to think with shadows or ghosts in order to try and sketch out a shape of what was once there, even if it's not correct in detail. And you probably won't get correct detail because that's the nature of a shadow or a ghost. You're trying to give an impression of a shape. For evidence of Lycian period economy, this has been worked on by Candice Rice most recently in her thesis that was submitted in Oxford a few years ago, and she's now in Edinburgh. And she was very kind to me and gave me her chapter. And this is one of the pieces of evidence that she pulls out. Now, this is a very pixelated image, but because I wanted to give you the impression of how fine the writing is on these things. This just looks like a stone, but there is this very, very fine epigraphy on it. And this is a Neronian period tax inscription from Archaic in Lycia. This is together with an inscription from Limera in Lycia, confirmation that in the Roman period, Lycia was operated independently in terms of its customs collection. So the Roman state did not actually collect the customs itself. Lycia was allowed to do what it wanted with the customs. As long as they paid their taxes, everything was grand. And luckily, this inscription indicates the sorts of things that they were taxing on. So one of the things was murex, and Candice has found lots of evidence of murex shells at Lycian ports. And that could have a double tax benefit because you tax the things coming in, or yes, I suppose fishermen would go out and bring the murex shells in, do whatever they needed to do, and if you dyed the cloth there, then you could tax it on the way out again. Fish, there's plenty of evidence for fish salting facilities at Roman period Lycian ports. Olive oil, central Lycia has lots and lots of terraces, and there are lots of terraces in various places in Lycia, which may have been either for vines or for olive oil production, and there are plenty of examples of presses through the area. And there's also dry pitch, which is interesting, a timber byproduct. And this is where I come to my main interest, which is timber. So this inscription doesn't actually mention timber itself, but this was also very desirable, and particularly desirable in the period that I'm dealing with, which is about 500 years before this inscription, back in the time of the Greco-Persian Wars, a time when the building of ships and navies was incredibly, incredibly important and intensified. So one of the benefits of being at the BIA is that I got to talk about this with Hugh Elton last night, and he was very, very helpful in chatting about how important it was that in this period people needed shipbuilding timber in particular. The Athenians were building a navy basically from scratch. So hundreds of ships, and they needed to get the wood from somewhere, and they needed the expertise. And it may be in this period that even for centuries to come after that, this was the most intensive shipbuilding period of its time, and Hugh calls it sort of World War Zero, the Persian Wars. So Lycia may have had this kind of resource. Evidence for forests and timber usage in Lycia are not as so sometimes you find that people sort of casually represent this as there's plenty and plenty of timber in Lycia. Well, there was, but the sources are actually a little bit spotty on it. So I've tried to gather them together. Theophrastus is often mentioned, and he talks about cypresses on Crete, Lycia, and Rhodes. Actually, this triad will come up later. But this is good for house building. He actually does specify which wood is good for building ships, and it's pine and cedar and fir as well, not cypress, which is good for house building. Pliny talks about a cedar grove near Candiba in central Lycia, but he seems to be talking about juniper cedars. Now, these can be quite big as well, but he seems to be talking about very knotty sort of trees, so perhaps not the kind of thing that you'd want for ship or boat building. Stephen Mitchell has talked about a treaty between Rome and Lycia of 46 BC, which mentions of what might be a forest called the Silvacera, which he thinks might be placed between Kaunos and Telmessos, perhaps over here. Now this is in a treaty, and it seems to imply that this is important property. So this is a sign that people are really interested in cordoning off areas that have important forest resources. And there's also an inscription from the Liatuon, which is a convention between Termessos in Kabalia, which is another Yaila up in this area. It's in the territory of Oinoanda, and the Lycian Federation. And basically it gives this community in Termessos the right to collect wood, among other things, the right to collect wood from this area. And Olivier Casaubon has suggested that this might be a managed forest area. Perhaps pushing it a bit, but at least that's some evidence. Later on, actually, there is better evidence for, and I'm sorry I've got typos all over the place here, but there is medieval evidence for, again, cypresses at Mira and timber exports from Lycia as well. And there was a notable Arab raid on Finicky over in eastern Lycia in 715 BC for cypress wood. So interesting, because Finicky is connected to this Yaila. This is where we saw the Karaburun tomb earlier, via the Archandos River. And that Yaila is still the home of a very large cedar forest, claimed on the internet to be the world's largest cedar forest. I'm not so sure about that. But this is proper cedar. This is pure cedar. This is not juniper. And this is a very special tree, and it's got a special sign on it, and it's got some men around it. You can see that basically 5 men would need to hold hands around that tree. That's about 2,000 years old, probably, that tree. Not all of them will be that old. That's why it's got its sign. But obviously this is a good forest, and I think it's not a stretch to imagine that this was present in antiquity as well. Probably roundly abused in antiquity. Now this position over here, Finicky, Limera, and this Yaila, and the route up to it, is interesting because this particular resource could possibly have a relationship between the expansion of our Lycian dynast Cuprally, who was building all these things and making all these coins, and his expansion from Lycia to Limera. He is the only dynast that is known to have minted coins both at Xanthos in western Lycia and in Limera in eastern Lycia. And this has only in the literature been represented in terms of the political expansion of Cuprally. But why was he expanding his power? Perhaps one of the reasons why is because he wanted to control resources that were available in this neck of the woods that were not so readily available in this neck of the woods. And also, I should say that there's something very, very different going on in this area of Limera and eastern Lycia than there is in western and central Lycia up until that point. So they may have different trade connections, different resources available, and he wants some of that. The Yaila is represented. I showed you that very Persian-y looking guy in the convoy earlier playing with his coat strings. This place is represented as being kind of pro-Persian, and some people, much as they've put a line between Cilicia and Lycia at this time, between the Persian Empire and on the one hand and the Delian League on the other, people have also liked to see a boundary between the Isla and southern coastal Lycia as well. This is largely based on that tomb, and I told you that I'd show you before this kind of riding habit, the riding garb. You can't, of course, see it terribly well because the painting has gone, and this is a sketch that I've just made myself from published photos. Here's the convoy over there, and this is where we're looking at this battle painting here. He's again got this long-sleeved garment on, long leggings on, tight-fitting leggings, his black beard, and he's got this saddle with thigh guards. It's something that's associated with the sort of tact they use in the Persian armies or their affiliates. And importantly, he's riding down these Greek hoplite style looking soldiers here. So based on this, one might think, yeah, actually, I'm a little bit more convinced. This is Persianizing. This is someone who's affiliating himself with the Persian cause, if you want to put it that way. But curious as well, in this area, there's also the Decadram hoard. Very important. Coin hoard. This is not a picture of that. It's just a picture of a hoard, just to show you what one could look like. If you happen to find one, you should be so lucky. And it's from exactly this area as well. And it's from exactly this period as well, around 460 BC. And this coin hoard has 1,000 coins of the Delian League, including members from the northern Aegean, and 900 Lycian silver coins as well. So this shows that something more complex is going on here. It's a little bit more complex than a simple Persian, anti-Persian opposition. And even though we don't know whether this hoard, especially not this hoard, was used to pay for timber by the Lycians, there's some kind of penetration going on between these areas. So all sorts of things going on in eastern Lycia and up in the Isla, which may have involved some kind of access to the particularly robust timbers there, which may have been really important, because if you're thinking about the type of timbers that you need to make masts, the type of timbers that you need to make keels, you need hardwood, good stuff, not just any old pine. There are questions about how you would get the stuff down to the coast and whether this is actually possible. That's something that I need to do some more thinking about. But if we're thinking about customers, now, first of all, supplies. Lycia doesn't have to be the only place in the Eastern Mediterranean to have timber for sale. They certainly were not. Cilicia and Syria were major suppliers and had very good forests. But all they needed to do is simply have it and benefit from actually organizing themselves and actually selling it on and promoting their product. In terms of customers, one obvious customer might be the Delian League itself. We know that Athens was building this large fleet, and I've already showed that there are connections between sort of Attic pottery styles and the sort of sculpture that they're using at Xanthos, and copying of coin types as well. And not least this Amala Hoard, which has all of these Delian League coins. But there are other possible customers too, and one of them would be notoriously timber-poor Egypt. So Egypt was also building a navy at this time. There are a few indications of trade between Lycia and Egypt. So for instance, there's a tax document of about this period, which was published by Porton and Yardini in 1993. It's got the story of this Grand Vizier, the sage of Assyrian, the Assyrian court, on top of it, but it's a palimpsest, so what's been rubbed off underneath. And I'm not quite sure whether this is exactly the right piece of papyrus, but it seemed to be related. It's just from the internet to give you an idea of what a papyrus looks like, basically. But underneath the secondary writing, you would find scraped off the remains of what was there before, and with special cameras you can read this sort of stuff now. And what they found is a tax document of the Achaemenid period. Surprise, again, exactly of our period. So either 475 or 454, depending on which king it's the year 11 of. And this tax document mentions merchants carrying into Egypt. It's from Elephantina, that's why I show it pointing down there. It mentions merchants carrying into Egypt lots of different things like wine, oil, metals, and wood as well. And Pierre Briand has pointed out that, so one of the ships, yes, this is something that Pierre Briand has pointed out, is that one of the ships seems to come from Phasaelis, which is on the east coast of the Deca Peninsula. It's not strictly Lycian, because Phasaelis should be a Rhodian foundation, and the text document does actually seem to talk about Ionians, which would be Greeks. The Persians tend to call everyone Ionians. So Greeks from Phasaelis bringing in such things as timber. But Briand also points out some of the ship's captains' names that are listed on this thing, and this is a document I have to get to grips with a little bit better, but some of these names may be Lycian as well, so there may be some more direct contacts. But there's also some other hints at direct contacts, which are finds of silver and pieces of metalware with Lycian inscriptions. Those are slightly later period, but also hoards with Lydian coins. So again, I'll show you my other generic picture of Hoard and the Asyut hoard, which is from here in between Saqqara and Elephantina. Again, surprise, of the right sort of period. So this is probably around, let's say, 480 BC, the closing date of the hoard. And it includes some coins of Cuprally. So, so that seems to imply that there is connection between the two places. There doesn't have to be a direct overlap. I told you that I'd show you a map of distribution of Lycian coins before and prove myself wrong because they don't all stay in Lycia. There's a good number of hoards that have been found in Lycia. And this excludes the very few that have been found outside of this area. But you can see that most of them tend to, I mean, some of them get way over here, but there's a lot of this kind of sweep around the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is interesting in that it shows that they were connected within the Eastern Mediterranean, which is not something that you would necessarily pick up if you were to go purely by pottery or even by the sculpture styles of things that we looked at. You might say this is quite an isolated place. And again, people have said that actually about Lycia from the pottery, because it doesn't seem to have a lot of Cypriot pottery, for instance. So things are not necessarily going this way, but they're going from Lycia around the Eastern Mediterranean. So how did one get to Egypt? Are we talking about cabotage, going along the coast on small coastal journeys, or are we talking about open sea routes? This map shows some of the currents and winds in the area. It's rather difficult to get down here if you're going against this current along the Levantine coast, but you do have these strong Meltem winds which go from west to east, and you could tack down to Egypt directly from there. And this seems to be a direct route that was known in the Roman period. Strabo, he's talking about the impossibility of a particular journey that's mentioned in Homer, and he uses as an example a direct journey from Rhodes or Lycia to Alexandria as a kind of control on that, and says, you know, that it's impossible that this you couldn't get from here to there in that time, because who's ever heard of anybody going from Lycia down to Alexandria in such a time? In fact, it turns out that it's only something like 15 kilometers an hour. I'm not convinced that that's very fast, but I'm not a sailor. So he's writing it about the time of Augustus, and I was talking with Hugh Elton last night again, and he was saying that there's an obvious connection between Egypt and Lycia all through the Roman period and through to the medieval period, and that this whole kind of Eastern Mediterranean is very much kind of bound up in the power structures that keep emerging in Egypt right through to the 19th century. And it's been suggested that the Roman port, or the port at Patara in Lycia, which is about there, very close to Xanthos. Now that was heavily developed in the Hellenistic period by the Ptolemies, and it's thought that that may have been developed in order to facilitate exactly this kind of open sea trade and direct route between Lycia and Alexandria. And for return routes, you could take the currents up anti-clockwise around the coast of the Levant. But again, if you wanted to go faster, you could take an open sea route. So this, of course, all depends on the kinds of ships you're using, which is yet another aspect that needs to be kind of unpacked more about this model. It's thought that you may take a route. So you're going down to Alexandria. You may take a return route up past Cyprus and immediately back. But there's another later papyrus which suggests, so there's a route that's talked about in this papyrus which indicates that people were going from Alexandria to Cilicia over here, but they had to put into Patara because their boat was damaged in a storm. And the question is the Patara at this time is I think it was called Arsinoe in the text, which is the Hellenistic name. So there's confusion about, is this port or is it somewhere in Cilicia? Well, the solution that's been proposed is that in fact it should be Patara, and that we're talking about a much wider return route, which would sensibly go to Kyrene, stop off there, perhaps stop off by Crete or go around it, and then go back past Rhodes and along the coast to the Lycian coast, and then catch the Meltem winds along the coast to Cilicia. Now, this is interesting because there are, I told you before, there's this kind of triad, Rhodes, Crete, and Lycia. There are lots of connections between the two. So Crete, there's a Cretan foundation myth of Lycia. Sarpedon, a brother of Minos, is supposed to have left Crete and come and founded Lycian communities. And Rhodes, there's Phasaelis is a Rhodian, supposed to be a Rhodian colony, and there's also another Rhodian colony called Rhodiopolis, also in eastern Lycia. And within the Al-Mala Hoard, there's also a single coin that says Rhodeon on it. So there are those connections, but really interesting, I found, was this connection with the Zeus Ammon head on the coin of Xanthos as well. So this coin type that they're copying from Kyrene. And with that, I'll just start to wrap up with some conclusions. So I started with this art and a rather simple way of seeing it as a response to these political circumstances. So art and war in rather simple political terms. But what I've tried to do is take a more critical approach to the historical context and try and see how this feeds back in. First, we can say that factoring in economics gives us something where Lycia and its art is seen not purely in terms of Greek versus Persian strife and how it fits between that, but as something which is part of an increased economic and cultural dynamism which is encouraged by that strife. So not something which is a kind of polarized political identity, but something which is enabled, in fact, by that war. And related to this, rather than seeing Lycia as being exploited by others, they can be seen as actually exploiting this situation themselves. So they're not passive people in the Mediterranean. 3, in terms of further exploration, this encourages thinking more about Lycia's relationship to the sea and could encourage more archaeological investigation of things like ports. And I've just mentioned that the French team who were working at Xanthos were actually starting to look much more at Lycia and the sea, and one of their more recent publications was Lycia and the sea, and there's a port not far from a later Roman period port down by the Laeton, not Patara, but another one, which could be late 5th century, early 4th century, and I wonder whether we could actually even find anything related to this period if we looked harder. Well, that's hard to say. But just thinking about their maritime presence as well, and putting perhaps even a navy back into place, or thinking about where that would fit into the period. And of course, this brings us to broader implications for connectivity and complex war economies. So not only figuring in the allies, so all of these other people who are kind of written out largely of these stories, we know they were there, but they don't really get much of a look in, but also thinking about how trade might either transcend or be disrupted by war. And that brings me to some issues to consider further. First, there are issues with commerce and trade. One, there are practical issues with the transportation of timber, as I noted. It's not so simple to get these huge 80-foot-long trees down from Isla to the coast. How does that actually work? So that's one thing that has to be looked at. Two, this is a rather neat solution. It's like just connect the dots. Oh yes, I see. Ooh, Kairini, is do some. Yes. Economy is never that neat, and it's very messy. And for instance, the coin distribution pattern does not necessarily tally with the trade of anything necessarily at all. So there are all kinds of intermeshed networks that need to at least be hypothetically taken into consideration. And three, as I said, that kind of whether commerce transcends war or whether it is disrupted by war, this is a debated point. Alain Bresson and Pierre Briand have differing opinions on this, and it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. Probably there's both. So, and sometimes war encourages even greater trade, and sometimes, there are blockades or there are particular restrictions which simply curtail things. So it's very, very complex, and you can't simply say, oh yes, it completely transcended war and everybody had a happy time continuing to trade as they always had done. And finally, there's the art and connectivity. So the art, obviously, at Xanthos is not directly related to this Eastern Mediterranean trade route that I have hypothesized here, and that's important. So it doesn't explain everything. You still have to look at the kinds of images they're choosing and the kinds of ways that they're trying to represent themselves. And again, this is another pattern which kind of intermeshes with all of these other things that are going on. So although what I've tried to show is that you shouldn't place things on a linear scale between Greece and Persia, and especially try and look at the art as expressing some kind of political identity that is somewhere between the two, or is either at one end or the other, polarized. You still can look at this art and try and get a sense of identity from it by looking at things such as the kind of mood that's being created. It's still enormously difficult to try and make any sense of the program that they have at Xanthos in many ways, because it's not a coherent program. There's no kind of state agenda. But what you can see that they're trying to do is create this kind of rather more whimsical, novel, really novel kind of eclectic bricolage of things which show that they have lots of connections and show that they're able to get in lots of different products and exert their power in that way. So not in a coherent way, but in a kind of collector's way, again. And in that way, try and carve out their own sort of position in a period which gave them lots of opportunities to become more powerful. And may not have continued to do so if there weren't as much shipbuilding later on. So, thank you. That's.
Well, thank you very much for dragging the shadows and ghosts out into the light and tying all these very complex dimensions, art, economy, identity, and war together during this presentation. And we have about 20 minutes for questions now, so who'd like to start us off? Okay, over there.
Winged things. You said at the beginning that it's obviously a taste for winged creatures. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to avoid winged creatures in the Near East Eastern context, but is there any connection perhaps with the Bellerophon myth and Pegasus being connected, that there is an interest in supernatural winged creatures there?
There's no indication at this period of any interest in Bellerophon. People have brought this up with another painted tomb that's slightly earlier in the Amala plain, where, and actually not on good grounds, because in fact they've taken an image as potentially presenting the chimera to a queen, but actually have a completely different interpretation of that image. There's obviously a relationship between Bellerophon killing the chimera, riding Pegasus to do it, and Lycia. And for those of you who don't know, the chimera is localized in Lycia. It's this monster that was kind of head of a lion and head of a goat and head of a snake all at the same time. And Bellerophon was charged by, he was from Corinth, and he came to Lycia and was charged by the Lycian king with killing this animal. But it's represented on later 4th century Lycian tombs. But there's nothing in this period which really shows it. And there are a couple of Pegasus figures or winged horses on coins, but nothing, coherent that would actually say that they're actually clearly concentrating on Bellerophon. Neither is there anything about Sarpedon, who was, now Herodotus writes about this Lycian foundation myth in the 440s. It's not very long after this. People must have been talking about it at the time, but you don't find any indication of this in imagery at all at the time. So although it's interesting, they're not very interested in myth, but they like these mythical creatures. There's the satyrs. Those are the closest you get to proper myth. But they're not really using it in this neck of the woods. It's weird.
I had a question. Are there any kind of remains of shipwrecks around Lycia or coastal areas around there that...
Well, there's the Bronze Age Ulabarun shipwreck. There are other shipwrecks. I'm not actually overly... Well, we have Matthew here. We can ask him.
I'm trying to remember where... There's all these baroons that INA is Excavator. I can never get them straight.
I think there are, but I'm not familiar with them.
Don't know. I'd have to
Yeah.
look them up. But can I ask a question? To turn the tables, I suppose?
yeah.
To avoid my lack of knowledge about that. I suppose I have an obvious bias, but I mean, I really like what you're saying, that these economic issues may be transcending some of these political issues in terms of this binary problem between the Greeks and the Persians. And I'm not familiar with this period, but I can think of other examples during the early medieval crusading period that demonstrate the very same thing, happening in the same area. But when you were thinking about the movement of timbers as a possible way of, I guess, transcending that political issue, I was thinking, what if, are there any commodities or goods within the Lycian area that the Persians would want that they cannot get? Because they have all
But they can't get, yeah.
Yeah, because they have all the Lebanese cedar there already.
Well, I mean, you could even get olive oil from everywhere else, or fish, or murex. I mean, there's nothing that I know of that's specific to Lycia that they couldn't get somewhere else. So yeah. No, unless they'd run out of good cedars from everywhere else, they'd use them up. I don't know. Greg Vortruba at one point did say to me that it's later as well, this evidence, but there is a kind of sense that there's a deforestation that kind of moves around the Eastern Mediterranean as they run out of trees in various places. So it's possible that it could become a reliable source somehow. Now this is where the difficulty comes with the political boundaries and things. I mean, what do you mean by reliable source? Is it reliable because they're allied at the time, or I mean, how does the Delian League fit into this capacity to supply potentially more product, whatever it was, than they had before?
Maybe the value of the place is that it's right next to this gradient. It's right next to this Persian area. What I'm most familiar with is being on Cyprus, right on the north side of that border. And there was a dramatic economic difference between being in the north and the south. And people from the Greek side would travel to the Turkish side simply to buy stuff.
Yeah.
It's cheaper. So they were ignoring all of the political issues
Yeah.
because they could save money.
Yeah.
So it might be something like that.
Yeah, they just undercut the Cilicians by,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
1 drachma lower per adds up to a lot.
Yeah.
Yes, we have a question from Susan.
I was just thinking, I mean, you're talking about the El Mali Hoard, and I mean, it was 900 Lycian coins and 1,000 from the Delian League. But were there any Persian coins in that one?
No, not that I'm aware of.
That's quite interesting. That gives you an idea that they're...
I might be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure that it's only Delian League coins and Lycian coins, yeah.
That would indicate that they were trading more to the west.
Yes, or at least getting in the money from there, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that they definitely must have been.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting that they were also involved in the Eastern Mediterranean, which you might kind of write them out of if you weren't looking at that kind of aspect of things. Yeah. Of course, Egypt, I say that they're, you know, maybe sending these timbers to Egypt. Egypt doesn't have its own silver either. So they've got to get their silver in from somewhere, and probably from Athens. So maybe they were getting these, you know, they were all circulating. I don't know. That El Mala Hoard is very interesting, and I don't know nearly enough about it. Again, it's one of these things that I have to study the ins and outs of a lot.
Any more questions? In which case, I have to quickly apologize for whistling when you mentioned the hoard of coins, which just sounded too interesting to me.
The greed, sort of dollar signs.
And thank you very much again for this very, very
Thanks. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I mean. I timed it at home, and it was only sort of 40 minutes or something, wasn't it? It seems to have expanded.
Well, there are a lot of things that we know that we definitely know after the lecture tonight. So
Or we definitely don't that we don't know. Yeah.
so, thank you very much
Or
once
not.
again.